All right, so I'm going to get into my throwback bag just a little bit today on this video. And I was having some conversations the other day, some all-time conversations. And one thing that always finds its way into those all-time conversations, whether we're ranking guys or just comparing one guy to the other, is this idea of translatability, right? Could this guy's game translate to this era? Yes, this guy dominated in the 90s, but what would he do if he played in the league today? So, perfect example, Larry Bird. People say all the time that while he was dominant in the 80s, he wouldn't be able to do the same things he did then in the league today. Or Michael Jordan. People talk about Michael Jordan and say things like, if he played in the league today, he'd be averaging 45, 50 points or whatever. So that idea of translatability always finds its way into these all-time conversations. And what I'm going to do on this video is rank off or just name off 5 guys who I believe would have zero problem in any era of basketball throughout the course of NBA history. And these are just going to be 5 guys, right? There could be others, and leave them in the comments if I missed them. But I'm going to start off here with a very obvious choice, and that is LeBron James. So there was a point in time where people tried to like run that card with LeBron where they were like, he couldn't do all these things he was doing in the 90s, especially like when he was in Miami. The assumption was that he was soft because he did flop a lot and he did kind of complain to the refs about fouls. I always thought that was funny because Jordan did the same thing, and most great players always did that. But regardless, people would always put that on LeBron. If LeBron played in the 90s, he wouldn't be able to get away with these types of things. I personally think a 6'9", 250-pound forward who's lightning quick, scary athletic, and has a ridiculously high basketball IQ, he's going to be fine in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. I don't think there is anybody, any team, any defensive scheme that is going to be able to contain LeBron James for an entire 82-game season. Let's say like you put him somewhere in the 80s, right? Maybe put him in like 1985 and threw him on a team. Nobody stopping that at all. Magic Johnson was dominant with the way he was being a 6'9", taller playmaking point guard. LeBron is like Magic Johnson taken to an extremely other level. Nobody in any era is guarding that. And another thing to kind of bring up is how LeBron has played through multiple eras. He kind of played before that 5-out offensive era that we have now, where teams are always looking to run at least 4 shooters on the court. He can dominate with spacing and without spacing. And in the 90s, there was a limited amount of spacing. Same thing with the 80s. LeBron could exist in an era where the court is a little bit more clogged up. And on top of that, he just simply is the all-time leading scorer. So it's going to be very difficult to leave the all-time leading scorer in the regular season and all-time leading scorer counting the regular season and the playoffs. It's hard leaving him off this list. I don't think LeBron is having any issues in any era of basketball, so I'm going to include him here. Another name, and I wanted to include this one pretty high on my list because I've had a lot of debates about this guy. It is Magic Johnson. So usually when people talk about Magic, it's kind of with this train of thought where they're like, yeah, in the 80s, Magic was all this, but he wouldn't be able to do any of that in today's game. So like I mentioned earlier, kind of that same thing that people did with Larry Bird. I beg to differ, right? Magic operated primarily as a true point guard. If we could like break Magic's game down to its simplest form, he is a true point guard. He was just different because he was tall, more physically daunting than a lot of other guys who played that position at that time and really throughout NBA history. He is the best oversized point guard of all time if you want to leave LeBron James out of that particular category. So that's what he was in essence. And he's one of the best thread the needle passers in league history, just one of the best playmakers, one of the best floor generals we have ever seen. So you're telling me that if he played in today's game, he wouldn't benefit from all of this spacing, both in half court and transition? Think about it. During his era, when he got out on the break, players weren't running wide. They weren't running out to the three-point line. Everybody was rim running, and he was still showing off that he could be this dominant transition playmaker. Now, think about it. Everybody is running out to the three-point line. There's more spacing. Magic would benefit from that on a huge level, right? And so that's one thing I don't think people really talk about a lot is they feel as if he doesn't have the best handle and things like that. And that may be true. He doesn't have a ton of handles, but he is a really good ball handler. Didn't turn the ball over a lot, but he would benefit in this era as far as his playmaking because of this spacing that we're seeing. And there are also some things that Magic could do to make himself a scoring threat. And again, this was kind of an add-on to his game. If we broke it down to his simplest form, like I said earlier, he is at his best a true point guard and a playmaker, but he could also put the ball in the basket if need be. For one, he had a very reliable mid-range jumper that he could step into. A lot of people don't talk about that. People don't think Magic can shoot. Magic really kind of got himself into a position to where he had a reliable shot. You really couldn't go under screens on him. And I know that's different in the 80s where going under a screen usually would be kind of like at the top of the key. And now it's like all the way out on the three-point line. But he had a reliable shot that he could get into on a consistent basis. And he could punish smaller guards in the post. This right now is a mismatch league, and teams are going to do everything in their power to try to get more favorable matchups on their best guys. So you're telling me if Magic played on a team today where everything is so mismatch honey and, teams are switching a ton, Magic wouldn't be able to dominate situations where he'd be able to get a smaller guard on him? I don't think so. I think he'd be just fine in that particular category. I think at minimum, Magic, if he played in the game today, he's averaging like 18 points and 15 assists, right? And if anything's lower than 18, I go like 16 to 15, which would make him one of the best point guards in the NBA with that stat line. So that, in essence, is dominating in another era. So I don't think there's an era where Magic would not be able to exist in. The only limitation is his lack of a perimeter jump shot. But then also, if we're going to have like these translatability conversations, you'd have to count in training, right? So Magic, I think, would, if he played in this era, get a reliable enough three-point shot. But that's a major hypothetical and a major if. But the game, with his game, with the way we saw it, I think if you put him in the game today, he would have a pretty good time out there. I don't think he'd have too much trouble. Like I said, there would be limitations, but he'd still be a dominant true point guard, a dominant true setup guy. I don't think Magic is falling off in any era of basketball. Another name here is Hakeem Olajuwon. So when talking about Hakeem, a lot of the focus is on his low post play, which I get. He is simply the most skilled low post player ever. But the Rockets in the 90s were very unique with other ways that they got him his look. So Hakeem was a an amazing mid-range shooter. So they'd run pin downs and curls to get him open for those mid-range looks, almost similar to how we see Jokic playing today. And on top of that, there's something that he has that a lot of other dominant big men in NBA history don't. And that's this thing where his defense can translate to any era. So, example, there are questions about whether or not Bill Russell would still be a dominant defender if he played in today's game. Or even guys like Dwight Howard, who was a great paint protector in his prime, but was never known for his defensive versatility. Hakeem is top 10 in steals all time and is by far the highest ranking big man on that list. And with his footwork and quickness, he could check guys out on the perimeter. He did that a lot in the 90s. He was by far the best big man in the 90s at just that. Yes, the quality of point guards that he was checking back then is different than the guys today like Curry, Kyrie, and Luka. This, in my opinion, or maybe in the last 10 years, is the strongest era of skilled point guards we've ever seen. But nonetheless, I think Hakeem has given us more than enough evidence that he could have his way defensively in a ton of different ways. And how he revolutionized defensive versatility for his position was unmatched. There is no other big man in NBA history who's as versatile of a defender as Hakeem Olajuwon. And one thing people were doing last year that I didn't like when the Nuggets won a title was comparing Jokic to him and saying Jokic is already better than him. One thing people would just leave out is what Hakeem was doing defensively. There is no big guy in the history of the game who I think was better defensively than Hakeem, and I think that could translate to any particular era. And there's another thing people also kind of do when talking about all-time guys, and they'll kind of talk about positional comp. And so you can't say that right now with Hakeem because he played in arguably the best era, most iconic era for big men. He played Patrick Ewing, Shaq, David Robinson, and dominated each of those guys in either the NBA Finals or in the NBA playoffs. So again, there aren't any questions about his positional comp. And we kind of have those questions about a guy like Dwight Howard, who didn't really have a ton of composition at that center position during his prime. So Hakeem is 100% a guy who I think his game could translate to any era, and he'd be as dominant in today's game as he was in the 1990s. Another one here is Stephen Curry. So I'm a little torn on this one. For one thing you have to kind of account for is the idea of coaching, right? So would a coach in the 90s allow Steph Curry to do some of the things that Steph Curry is doing today, right? So that's one thing to kind of bring up for the sake of this debate. Let's assume yes. Let's assume that coaches are letting Steph Curry shoot it from anywhere he wants, quite like Steve Kerr let him do it. Just given that, there are a lot of guys in the 80s and 90s who would have a tough time trying to guard that guy. Simple as that. They weren't used to going out there all the way far back out there to guard him. He's running across the half court the entire time looking for open shots. He's screening guys and slipping out of screens out into the three-point line. It's just so much movement going on. he'd have a really easy time creating looks for himself off the ball. He's just one of the best in NBA history at creating looks for himself off the ball, as well as being able to create shots for himself when he has the ball in his hands. And also, Curry is an underrated finisher, and he's big. Like, Steph Curry is not a little dude. So we talk about guards getting punished in the paint. Steph Curry has shown this ability to get into the paint and have these like creative finishes around the basket. He is a very underrated finisher at the rim. The only pullback is there was a more physical era in the 90s. Guys were able to push guys around and check them a bit. And so that could slow down Steph Curry's momentum a little bit as far as his off-ball action. But given the point that he's the greatest shooter in NBA history, there are just a limitation of guys who'd be able to stop him throughout the course of NBA history. There's nobody in this era who could stop him. And the 80s and 90s, there was a shortage of amount of guys who were used to moving that much in the half-court setting to try to contain a guy who can shoot it from anywhere on the court. And on top of that, he's a great leader and he knows how to win. And Curry has a killer instinct. You don't have 4 championships and that many finals appearances without a killer instinct. So Steph Curry was kind of a controversial one that I want to include. Again, the shooting just kind of gets him on this list. There's nobody anywhere who could stop him from a shooting standpoint, who could truly contain him. Yes, they could hand check him a bit, but Curry's still going to get his at least 27 points in any era. So I wanted to include him here on this list. And finally, I'm going to go with Nikola Jokic. There's not anything right now that Nikola Jokic does, and right now he's in his prime, where I think it'll be taken away in like the 90s or 80s. Jokic is physical. He can rebound. He's a fundamentally sound player. He keeps the game very, very simple. He can play that traditional big man thing where he's physical around the basket. He can bump guys, kind of grind against them down low on the post. There's nothing that Nikola Jokic really does that I think could be taken away in like the 80s, 90s, 70s, or 60s, right? He's just a really fundamentally sound guy who does the basic center things at a very, very high level. He can pass, all of those things. And I do think next to Hakeem, he may just be the most skilled center of all time with his passing and things like that. You can run an offense through him. There's just not a thing that Nikola Jokic does that I just don't think is translatable through different eras of the NBA. He's just a really complete basketball player. He's solid enough from a defensive standpoint. And think about this. If he could survive defensively in this era, and he's not a dominant defender, but if he could survive defensively in this era, then he'd be fine defensively in any era as far as big men go, right? And how teams were using big men on that end of the floor. So Jokic is definitely somebody who I think is fine anywhere in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, or whatever the case may be. His lack of athleticism is one thing, but again, he's such a fundamentally sound player. It's hard trying to imagine an era where he'd struggle and have problems. Now, if he played in the 90s, would he be able to have his way against guys like Hakeem, Shaq, and David Robinson? We'll see. I think defensively, he may struggle against them because defensively he struggles right now against Joel Embiid, but he'd get his on the offensive end for sure, 100%. Now, there's also this. There's less spacing in the 90s and 80s, so does he do as well with that lack of spacing in those eras? We'll see. But still, even with that, Jokic still can play physical. He can do those little things, and I think in any particular era of basketball, he is perfectly fine. So those are 5 guys who I think could be translatable to any era. And there were some names I left off. And again, if I left guys off that you think should have been on this list, let me know in the comments. But like I said, we have those all-time debates. Translatability always comes up. And these are 5 really unique names, some controversial names, who I think will be just fine in any era of NBA basketball throughout the course of the league's history.